So welcome to the Keen on Yoga podcast. This week we're back with another guest, and I'm really pleased to announce that it's Ramesh Bjonnes. I read one of his recent books, and it's Brief History of Yoga. That's the title. And it's an excellent book. So scholar practitioner or practitioner scholar, Ramesh, welcome to the Keen on Yoga podcast.
Thank you, Adam. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so as I said, I read the recent book, Brief History of Yoga, and it stuck out at me because as we've been talking before we came on, Ramesh is not an academic as such, but definitely a scholar. And the book, honestly, I get the book because it's easy to read and it's not overly scholarly. So it's at a level where anyone, including me, can read it. But yet again, it's not just like whatever he thinks. It's well informed, but yet not out of one's grasp, right? So particularly in this book, what piqued my interest was this idea that he has of the Tantra, and the idea that basically the Tantra doesn't come later than the classical period of yoga, that it actually developed alongside the Vedic tradition. So perhaps, before I dig myself into a hole here, Ramesh, maybe you could say just a couple of words, as we've been talking before, on this idea that's really the heart of your work, I think, really.
Yeah, that's true. It's an untraditional way of looking at it, perhaps. But also, when we look into different scholars and their writings, and in particular my teacher and guru, Sri Anandamurti, because when I was introduced to yoga in the mid-70s, I thought that the way he presented the history was the way that everybody looked at history. But as we know, history is contested and often written by the rulers, and there are different versions of history. So it was actually several decades later that I realized that his version of history was not the academic way of looking at history. Because if we are looking at yoga history from the text, for example, and date everything according to the text, then Tantra is usually looked at to be around 1500 years old. So between 500 after Christ and around 1000 when Kashmir Tantra became predominant, and we have the Kashmir Tantric text. But Anandamurti and Aladdin and some other Indian scholars, Bhattacharya, Sakara, they are saying that the Shaiva tradition from which Tantra and probably yoga came from is much older. And the difficulty, of course, is because it was primarily an oral tradition. So it's kind of like saying, well, is shamanism only as old as the first book on shamanism? Or is it, thousands or hundreds of years older? So given that context, I started to look at what is the proof, what are the scientific, genetic, historical, textual references that could back up that idea. And so that's really you could say the context of my book. And so I came up with this theory that I call the two river theory, that yoga is partly Vedic, but mainly Shaiva, yogic, Tantric, and that these two rivers are kind of influenced each other. The other way of looking at it is that in anthropology, we talk about ethics and emic, or ethic and emic way of looking at things. So the ethic is the anthropologist comes into a culture and studies it. And the emic is when someone from within the culture is presenting their story, their view, their culture. So in a sense, we could say that Morty's point of view is an emic one. He's saying that the king of yoga, Shiva, which is the mythological way of explaining Shiva, is the founder of yoga and Tantra. He was a historical person, according to him, like Buddha, Krishna, and that it came from that stream, and that stream was outside. And so supporting that, you have, for example, Edwin Bryant, who would say that yoga was in opposition to Vedic orthopraxy. It was not ritualistic, not external, not offering, not sacrifices. It was an internal enterprise. So then you have the Pashupati nut seal that was found in the Indus Valley civilization, which scholars are debating, and most academic scholars are saying, no, we can't really, figure that out. What is it? What kind of position and so on. But then you have someone like Thomas Machiavelli, an art historian who wrote a very interesting essay called An Archaeology of Yoga, basically saying that the position the figure is sitting in, it's Guraksha Asana. It is a tantric pose that is part of awakening Kundalini from a Hatha yogic point of view. And when you look at the figure, it makes very much sense. So these are some of, you could say, evidences or traces that I have been digging into. Then finally, you have this idea of the Vedic people. And so the Vedic tradition is saying that they're indigenous to India. They didn't come from anywhere. Then you have others who are saying, no, they came from the outside into India and brought with them the Rig Vedic, already formed religion, which was ritualistic, sacrificial, praying to the gods in heaven, and so on and so forth. Not yogic in that sense, not introversial. And so Machiavelli is saying that yoga most likely came out of shamanism, because shamanism was different from the priestly culture in that it was seeking the understanding between the cosmic and the individual. What are the powers that are without and the ones within, as above, so below? These kinds of enterprises took place within the shamanic, yogic, tantric tradition. So those are some of the perspectives that I am looking at in the book. And so when the Vedic Aryans came into India, they had a different culture than the people that were indigenous, the Dravidians, the Mongolians, and the Ostrics. And this all fits into recent genetic research in the Out of Africa theory, where they're basically saying we as modern humans are about 80,000 years old. We came out of Africa, and then people spread to different parts of the world. So that's in brief the puzzle that I've kind of put together. And then, of course, some agree and some very much disagree with that. Awesome. It's a very interesting possibility.
In the modern situation, as we talked about before, it's highly contentious. Obviously, in India now, that yoga is Hindu and 5,000 years old and Vedic. But yeah, for you, what you were saying, in fact, I think at one point you mentioned that actually some of the DNA was possibly linked with similar Aboriginal DNA. Was that correct? Or the Dravidian
it depends
people.
What you mean by Aboriginal. So if you're looking at the Out of Africa theory, then the first people that came to India were the Aborigines that migrated from South India to Australia about 60,000 BC. So that's the Aboriginal context. And this makes sense when you look at the people in South India, often with curly hair and so on. And the features are very similar. So that is pretty much established and accepted science. And then the second wave were the Dravidians that had settled in the Middle East for thousands of years. And they moved then into India, and then part of that group moved into China and Mongolia, and they became the Mongolian. And so due to climatic changes and so on, skin color changed and so on and so we are, in a sense, we are Africans. We are African under the skin, whether our skin color is white or more yellow or brown.
Right.
That's interesting way of looking at it.
But it does definitely make sense. But what are the other implications of this theory that the idea that we're practicing essentially really tantric or shamanic practices in the modern context of hatha yoga, which is the most popular form of practicing yoga and what my listeners mainly practice, which is essentially a tantric practice or a shamanic practice, and not a Vedic practice after all. Does that make a difference if we're looking at our practice from a different lens?
I don't think practice is practice.
Right.
And so we have philosophy, which is, we could say, our worldview, which I think is important. What is your worldview? So if someone is practicing Tantra, like let's say, for example, Kashmir Tantra, or the Hatha Yoga tradition from the Middle Ages, yes, that is definitely Tantric, of course. And so the interesting part there is when you look at, for example, texts like the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, where it basically says in the beginning that without Raja Yoga, Hatha Yoga is useless. So that's an interesting context. So what does Raja Yoga means? Well, it most likely means the yogas in the Yoga Sutras, which is a text, a psycho-spiritual text in a way. We could say teaching tool for the body, mind to move into spirit, to achieve the realization of Purusha through, Ishvara, if you are throwing in a more sort of bhakti, Ishvara Pranidhana context. So the Tantra in the Middle Ages, to me, is a representation or a written down version of what came much earlier. And that again is, opening up a Pandora's box of possibilities. But that's what, for example, Alaa Danilou has done, and many of his sources are from the Puranas and from the Agamas. So you have these are different texts, and the Puranas, it's difficult because they're a mixture of mythology and historical chronology, and so you have to kind of sort through it. And then you have the interesting angle from where Anandamurti comes, who is a person, a guru, a contemporary guru that never used any books. He never referenced anything. He was just sitting there talking and drawing textual references out of thin air and creating a history, a kind of revisionist history, if you like, which he calls Shivakti and Shivology, meaning the history of Shaivism, the history of Tantra from the Shiva point of view. And the amazing part of it is that he had this ability. He was the one that introduced me to the idea of the Aryans coming from the outside at a much earlier time than the modern Western scholars like Max Muller was talking about. Mm. And then, I get the surprise in around 2000 when geneticists are saying, yeah, Max Muller was wrong. The migration started much earlier. And so then I'm sort of putting these contexts together. Here we have a guru that is not seemingly modern, yes, but not really using modern means. He's just sitting there talking. Where is that knowledge coming from? And so when you put that into an epistemological context, what is knowledge? Where does it come from? And then it becomes yogic to the core, because then you're talking about intuition, then you're talking about Siddhis. Now you present that to scientists, they will be skeptical, so on and so forth. So this is the broader context that I've been living within. How do you deal with that? You have this person that is a polymath. He knows something about everything. He wrote on economics, physics, linguistics. He was a Sanskrit scholar, and on and on and on. And then, creating a superb new tantric text called Ananda Sutra. So
before you go on, I kind of feel that we need to introduce Anandamurti to the audience, because I was going to come to this later, but I mean, Ramesh has had and as his guru for many years, and the fundamental part of your life and your spiritual path, I believe. And you've talked about him to me a little. Can you just say the basics to the audience so they might kind of read for themselves or find out more? Like, where did he come from? When was he born? When was he living? How did you meet him? Just a basic introduction maybe would be useful, because he sounds like an incredible kind of figure.
Yeah. So Anandamurti was born in Jamalpur in, I think, 1920 or 1921. He was, you could say, and this is not entirely unusual in the yoga tradition. He was a born mystic. He revealed his unusual personality at a very young age. He could speak many different languages before he went to school. Didn't have much of an education. He went to high school and a little bit of university in Kolkata. But then his father passed away, and he went back home to support his family and worked in the railroad department. And that's when he was revealing his teachings and his role as a Tantric guru slowly over time. And this was in the mid-50s. And then he developed an organization finally called Ananda Marga. And then in the 60s, he became more of a public figure in India. Many thousands of intellectuals and middle-class people who were interested in his progressive ideas. He spoke out against the caste system. He had progressive ideas about economics. And simple things like, he said, women should also dance kirtan and, get up. Don't, let the men tell you what to do and so on and so forth. So he stirred the pot. And then in 1971, I believe it was during Indira Gandhi's reign, where there was the emergency. She was basically kind of a dictatorial prime minister, and a case was concocted against him. He was in prison, and he was in prison for 7 or 8 years. He fasted in protest for 5 years, which is in itself, pretty miraculous, and which is all, documented and factual. And during this time, that was when I was introduced to his work. I was living in Norway. I was born in Norway. And I found it interesting because I was a young socialist. And here I'm encountering a person that is both a yogi and progressive in so many ways in terms of ecology, economics. I talked about cooperatives, not corporations, local economy, and so on. And then at the same time, he's this amazing yogi and teacher and philosopher, and has practices and so on. So it just sort of blew me open, and that's how at that time I got introduced to these practices. So that's a little bit of his story. And yes, he's controversial, and no doubt about it. But that is often the case with great personalities. They become controversial within their culture often, including Buddha, Krishna, Jesus. You look at great teachers. They don't necessarily follow the norm or fit into a certain category.
And you can find books on Anandamurti, I believe, on his life, and I've read a little bit, and definitely does seem to have miraculous kind of insight and powers, as you mentioned, his Siddhis. Definitely worth exploring more. Would you recommend a particular book if people are interested in finding out more about him?
Yeah, there's one book called Advent of a Mystery. There's actually 2 books. Advent of a Mystery, you can find that on Amazon, and then the Jamalpur Years by
that's the one I read a little. Yeah.
Jamalpur
So we'll put
Years.
them in the show notes for everyone, and you can read a little bit more about him. I think I read the early years. It's when he was born, and all the stuff around his birth and his young years. Yeah, it was interesting.
Right.
So carrying on. So now we know a little bit more, because I mean, this guru informs, I think, a lot of Ramesh's background. So I think he's an important figure in this conversation as well. But we did want to talk a little bit more about your scholarly work and going back to the yoga aspect again. When you were suggesting the Pashupati seal, which is this idea of this guy, seems to be a guy with a horned headdress or horns, sitting in a cross-legged or yoga position surrounded by a few animals. And this seal was found in a couple of ancient settlements in North India, suggesting to people that yoga indeed is Indian, and well, it is Indian certainly, but even Hindu and 5,000 years old. But nevertheless, it wasn't really, I don't think it's really been taken that he was actually practicing yoga so much, right? As you were suggesting, that this is actually yoga posture. I think that itself is controversial. I think you even suggest that he is not actually an ancient god, because the Trimurti of Shiva, Vishnu and Brahman comes later. But you're actually suggesting, I think, in your book that is Shiva on the seal itself.
No, I'm not necessarily suggesting it's Shiva.
Okay.
So the seals were found in the 1920s, actually by an Indian archaeologist. But then, of course, the British had control over India at that time. So the British got the honor. And it was called the Pashupati, not seal. So Pashupati is also another name for Shiva. So that's the the context.
Proto-Shiva, Pashupati.
Yeah, Proto-Shiva. Yeah. So, and there were some other figures that were found at that time. There's so when, for example, I teach the history of yoga to yoga teacher students and so on. Then I show some other figures, and one of them is a figure of a person that is seemingly gazing at the tip of his nose, and in the statue, then the nose has come off, and I joke and saying, that's why he's been staring at his nose for so long. But it's a tratak, kind of a gaze, focusing, or dharana. And then there's another figure with bilva leaves around, and these are all from the same period. So here we have a figure that is sitting in a tantric asana, gurakshasana, pressing the heels up into the scrotum, inducing kundalini awakening. And then you have another figure that has bilva leaves. Bilva leaves are used in the worship of Shiva. And then you have the other one with the gaze and so on. So those are some archaeological evidences from that period. So I'm not suggesting that this is necessarily Shiva, but it could be in the worship of Shiva. But what it more indicates to me, and this is what Machiavelli is pointing out too, this sort of relationship between shamanism, the horns, the animals, and the yogic position. The yogic position to me is very, very clear and distinct, and that's why I'm surprised that academics are sort of not wanting to deal with it. So, and the animals may be part of the fact that Shiva was a lover of animals, and Pashus, the animal, is in relation to Shiva, are our animal instincts, fear, hunger, and so on. So that's another sort of symbolic context. But also the fact that Shiva was a lover of animals, of nature, and sort of the king both of yoga and of the natural environment.
Don't you think that the scholars might not want to?
I want to mention another thing in relation to that. What is also very curious, and listeners can look this up as well. In Denmark, they found a figure called the Gundestrup cauldron. It's on a silver cauldron. And the interesting thing about the Gundestrup cauldron is that it is strikingly similar to the Pashupati seal in India. It's a figure sort of sitting more in a tailored position, more like an easy pose in yoga, but again with animals around, a snake in one hand and something in the other, and also with the horn, so which is often termed as the horned god. And so again, you see this, and how is that possible? Well, it could be independently developed, but it could also be ideas coming from the east into the west. It could be people from the north traveling east and so on. Because we know that, yes, there was migrations into India during the Aryan migration, but there was also migrations out from India, even at an early time. Geneticists have also found that there are Indian genes in the Scandinavian gene pool. So these are all, interesting aspects to the whole history of yoga.
Just kind of proves once again that Westerners don't really have the hips for it. He's sitting in, he's changed his pose to an easier pose where his knees aren't hurting so much. Yeah. Even back then, he's like, I can't sit in that. I gotta make it a bit easier.
Yeah.
Don't you think that maybe the Western, I was going to say before, don't you think that the Western scholarly denial of the fact that this is an asana, is a hatha yoga posture, is to do with this seeming interest to turn the hatha yoga tradition into simply a Vedic tradition of meditation, which we also see with, say, the Yoga Sutras, which you were suggesting wasn't simply a tract for meditation, but was also had some aspect of praxis involved with it, which is in a more tantric manner. What do you think about that?
Yeah. So for example, when I was introduced to yoga or tantra, I met a monk, an Indian monk, a Kapalika, which is part of a Kapalik is one that meditates on the graveyards and so on, in the tantric tradition. And so I learned a technique of mantra initiation, and then gradually 6 different lessons of meditation, and then asanas. And he was explaining this in the context of Ashtanga Yoga, and also Raja Di Raja Yoga, the King of Kings Yoga. So you have Raja Yoga, which is often, in the context of the Yoga Sutras. But then, according to Anandamurti, there's something called Raja Di Raja Yoga, which is sort of a tantric version of that. But so if you would ask Anandamurti who was Patanjali, what was his practices, he would say he was a tantric. And interestingly, Edwin Bryant, in his book on the Yoga Sutras, which by the way is excellent, says that he was most likely a Vaishnava or a Shaiva, the historical. Anandamurti even pointed out, and hopefully historians will be able to corroborate this in the future, the village where Patanjali was born and so on. So from that perspective, the practices in the Yoga Sutras are tantric. Yama niyamas are the ethics, and then you have asana, the asana practices. It is not a teaching manual on asanas by any means. Basically, I was taught in the same way, and my teacher said, why are you practicing asanas? For 2 reasons. One, to make your body supple so that you can sit still for long periods of time. And second, to balance your hormones related to the chakras. So the glandular endocrine system is related to the chakras and so on. And asanas are to balance that. Of course, Patanjali doesn't talk about that, but he also doesn't teach you the lessons. He's explaining the philosophical context of the lessons, but he's not teaching you how to practice dharana. He's not teaching how to practice pratyahara. So when I was introduced to Tantra, I was taught a technique in pratyahara, bhuta shuddhi, asana shuddhi, and chitta shuddhi, how to withdraw the senses from the body or from the outside world, from the body, and then the mind. So these are 3 stages. And then you get into the dharana practice. Then you can concentrate, because if the mind is out there listening, smelling, or attached to the body, oh, I'm feeling this, I'm feeling that, then as Patanjali says, how are you going to be able to still the mind? How are you going to be able to quiet the chitta? So these techniques I was taught were tantric, and yes, I believe that. I hadn't even read the Yoga Sutras, didn't even know about it. But I was taught all of these practices that fit into that 8-limb Kriya Yoga or Tantra Yoga, whatever term you may use for it. So my sense from my experience is that these techniques were largely taught outside of the text, within an oral tradition, sitting down with a teacher, transmission of mantras, siddha mantras, or ishta mantra, as Anandamurti would call it. And they were given as a secret transmission. Basically, you were told, don't repeat that mantra to somebody else. Don't let anybody else use the mantra that you have been given. And so that the teachings were kept within that oral tradition and not watered down or changed and so on and so forth. And so I believe that there's been an oral tradition that, of course, existed when there was no written language, but that has continued and continued to this day, that you will not find in the text. For example, how to pronounce the mantra correctly so that it creates mantra gat, or the awakening of the kundalini. So you may see a mantra in the book, but you don't know how to pronounce it. You don't know how to use it on the breath, and so on and so forth. So these are subtle differences between the textual knowledge and the experiential knowledge, or the transmission between the teacher in the oral tradition. So there's so many things that you don't find in the text, and in particular the Yoga Sutras, for example. It is a beautiful psychological, philosophical context to the oral tradition's practices. And so when you know both, then you understand it. And for example, this conundrum, is yoga union or is it separation? Academic will debate this forever and ever. Is the Yoga Sutras dualistic? Is it, and so on and so forth. Yes, it is dualistic philosophically, but is it practically? And so, for example, between the second sutra, Chitta Vritti Nirodha, and the third one, where it is said, when your mind is still, the seer is revealed. Well, who is the seer? Ishvara, Brahma, Shiva, whatever name you put on it. So was that the union experience? Is it a separation experience?
I think that kind of contradiction often seems to happen in the Yoga Sutras, where you're suddenly kind of feeling he's definitely talking about disunion at a point, and then he's talking about kind of like merging of consciousness with the one, or everything becoming one experience, and you start to feel otherwise.
It's like you need this union until you get the union. In other words, not this, not that. So that is a practical vision. So that's you could say, the dualistic version. Tantra will say, and this is, to me, is the elegance of Tantra, because it sort of embraces both Vedanta and Patanjali, the dualism of Patanjali and the non-dualism of Vedanta, basically saying, well, there is union in everything. There's the possibility of union in everything. And that's where you need to go. And so whereas in Patanjali's philosophy, Purusha and Prakriti are separate, in Tantra, they're always together. And so everything has the possibility of yoga. Everything has the possibility of transmutation of the yogic experience. Our conversation, me eating food, doing the dishes. Because why? Because Purusha, consciousness, Shiva is in everything. There's no separation.
I think one point you raise is the Yoga Sutras, which is the modern kind of gospel of yoga, for whatever various reasons, just because it doesn't mention Kriya Yoga aspect, it doesn't really mention the practices of meditation either. So there's not really an argument for the fact that it's not a text that's also citing traditions of practice other than meditation, right? Just because it's simply not referring to either thing, really. It just provides an overview of the whole kind of landscape, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned mantra a little bit, and I think kind of a great deal of your practice has been around mantra. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the basic meditation technique in Tantra is mantra based,
mm-hmm.
and there's a whole science behind that. So you have two kinds of mantras. One is universal mantras, Om Namah Shivaya. Anybody can chant, sing, meditate on, and so on. And then you have personal mantras, Ishta mantras, as Anandamurti termed it, or Siddha mantras that are given through the awakening of the Mahakala or the Tantric Guru. And so those are the mantras that are kept in secret and that have power. And I experienced that, to my shock, several times in the beginning, how powerful these mantras can be.
Do you have any examples of that?
Yeah, for example, so when I started this path, I was 19 years old when I got initiated first. And so I had been meditating for about probably 6 years. And then I went to India and decided to become a monk. And I did become a monk. I was in India about 2.5 years and got ordained as a monk, came back to the West. And as a matter of fact, to the United States. And I was initiating people because I had been ordained doing that. And one time I was initiating this young man, and when I gave him the mantra, when I whispered it into his ear, there was something about him. I could feel his vibration. I actually thought, wow, this is a yogi, because in yoga we talk about previous lives and so on, and I felt, wow, this guy has been a yogi in his previous life. These thoughts came to me. As soon as I whispered a mantra into his ear and I told him, please repeat this. And a few seconds later, he'd go, oh, he just fell backwards into, a doctor would say he's in a coma. But he was totally blissful and ecstatic. He just fell backwards just from the repetition of the mantra. And he was out for like 20 minutes. And of course, I was young. I had no experience with things like that. Of course, I had seen people doing it in India through kirtan or meditation. I'd seen these things, but somebody in front of me and, never. So I was shocked. And after some time, the guy comes out of this experience totally blissful, and he starts holding my hands and saying, "You're my guru, you're my guru." It's like, I said, "No, I'm not your guru, There's another guru. I'm just a teacher and I'm just transmitting this." So anyway, through experiences like that, I realized the power of these Siddha mantras. However, what is needed for things like that to happen is a synchrony between the power of the mantra and the samskara of the receiver. In other words, another person didn't experience that. Why? Because he didn't have the samskaras for that experience. So these two need. So that is one way of explaining that within the context of yoga philosophy.
I think you mentioned Tantra a lot, and I think for some of our audience, I forget sometimes the kind of press that Tantra generally has in the West. Would you like to define what you mean by Tantra as opposed to something that what people might have come across more to do with self-expression, even sexual expression, that we might call Neo-Tantra?
Right. So Tantra from the Tantric tradition, if you explain it, from the word itself, so Tan means to expand, Tra means to liberate. So it is a path of expansion and liberation. Anandamurti puts a different spin on it in saying that the Pa sound signifies inertia or sort of the Tama guna. And he says that Tantra is the expansion from the state of bondages to the state of liberation. So these are sort of two etymological ways of explaining it. The Tantric tradition, as with everything yoga, has different expressions. And so you have, for example, left-handed Tantra, which is into occult powers and, different antinomian kind of practices and some sexual practices and so on. The 5 M's are often referred to in that context. But then there is sort of the middle path of Tantra as well, which is internalizing the 5 M's. So Maituna is one of the 5 M's, sexual union. But in the middle path, Maituna means the awakening of Kundalini, and so it has an esoteric spiritual meaning. So yes, you have these two broadly. There are even more, expressions of Tantra. But these practices are very different than what I would call Neo-Tantra, which really grew out of partly from a Western theosophical sort of ideas, Blavatsky, and later on the Bernard brothers in the United States, who brought kind of the tantric philosophy and yoga and sort of mixed sexual practices and so on. And like George Feuerstein, says, calls it California Tantra or hot tub Tantra, So that to me is more of a sensual sexual practice mixed with tantric philosophy. And there are definitely beautiful aspects of that, and I think it has its place, but it is not classical Tantra. It is not based on the classical, certainly not the middle path of Tantra. So there's a big difference between the two.
Kind of practices were you taught tantrically by your guru?
So there were 6 basic lessons. He used the term Sahaj Yoga. The first lesson is a mantra-based meditation in which you're basically practicing pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana. Those 4 aspects which we find in the Yoga Sutras. The first lesson is a mantra meditation with visualization and concentration in a chakra that is somewhat different from person to person depending on samskaras. Second lesson is called Madhuvidya, which is another mantra that you're using before speaking, before eating, before making love, and when you're in the world. And the idea that everything is an expression of Brahma. Madhu Vidya. Madhu means honey, honey knowledge. Everything is an expression of consciousness. And this also relates to the Tantric explanation of Brahmacharya, because Brahmacharya in the yamas and the niyamas, according to Tantra, does not mean celibacy or sexual restraint, but rather Brahmacharya, to move, to be in the context or in the approximation or in oneness with Brahman. So it's a different. It doesn't mean that sex, all the time is more in tune with Brahman. It doesn't mean that either. There is definitely limitations on our energy and so on. So Tantra looks at it from a different point of view. And Anandamurti says that original context was changed by the Brahmins. Anyway, that's another. So, and third lesson is meditation on the chakras, visualization of the chakras and the control of the Buddhas and the elements, and harmonizing the different aspects. Fourth lesson is pranayama, but it is not hatha yoga pranayama. It is raja dhiraja pranayama, which is slow, with a mantra, with ideation, and some higher stages with kumbhak and so on. And then fifth lesson is again.
How does that? Sorry, Ramesh. How does that differentiate from the hatha yoga then? If you're doing kumbhakas and you're.
I'm not saying it's entirely different. I'm just saying that, like some hatha yoga pranayamas are like breath of fire and so on. They're fast.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of controversy in the yoga community. Some are saying that, wow, you need a lot of preparation in order to do this, and they create too much raja guna, and they disturb the mind more than they calm it down, and so on. So what I'm trying to say is that in the meditative practice of these lessons, the pranayama is slow. Why? Because you want to slow down the breath as much as possible. We are breathing about 14 times per minute. In meditation, you bring your breath down to 2-3 times per minute. And in some samadhi states, the breath, stops. So, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. As after all, Patanjali was saying, when he talks about pranayama, he's talking about breath cessation, really, isn't he? Not breathing more or even breathing patterns, but, kind of seems like he's saying don't breathe at all. And secondly, I would suggest that some of the hatha yoga pranayama confusion is to do with the hatha yogas basically using pranayamas or breathing patterns as kriyas. They're not really, breath of fire, kumbhaka, Bastrika, this kind of thing, Kapalabhati. I would suggest somewhat perhaps kriyas or preparatory exercises.
True. I'm not saying that it doesn't have its place. I'm saying that I was explaining the lesson.
Yeah. And to backtrack again about when you was mentioning about controlling the chakras, people would be pretty interested in that. How would you go about doing that?
So that is in the third lesson, where you are using mantra and visualization on the elements. The chakras are related to the 5 elements: space, air, fire, water, and earth. These elements in the 5 first chakras, and so it's through visualization and then using certain mantras. So it's dharana. And again, these are lessons taught, orally, and so on. So they're not in books.
Yeah.
You won't find it in books.
Okay, so you don't that, and then the pranayama, and then what was the other? That was the fifth. That was the fourth.
Yeah, the fifth one is again a meditation on the chakras, chakra shodhana, where you're using mantras in each of the chakras. It's sort of a circular kind of meditation, and it's very, very blissful because you're vibrating the different chakras. And then the sixth lesson is Guru Dhyan, which is again, orally taught meditation practice, which I can't really reveal too much about, but it is using yantra as a gateway to consciousness. So because Tantra is about using energy, gathering energy in a point, in a concentration, and through that doorway, you open up into consciousness. That's the purpose of bringing all this together in samyana, as in yoga. So it's that union, bringing it together, that creates dhyana or the flow. And then, if you're practice enough and you have the samskaras, then samadhi.
Nicely put. And what about your own experiences with Siddhis? You talked quite a lot in different things that you've written about spectral powers. Have you had any other experiences apart from giving that guy the mantra with having experiences in practice?
Yeah, certainly. With my experiences with my guru, certainly so many amazing experiences with him. And personally, I can mention one experience where I had an experience of clairvoyance or extrasensory perception through some samadhi experience. There are many different kinds of stages of samadhi. It actually started as a dream, in a lucid dream, where I was with my guru, and there was a transmission through the relationship with the guru that was incredibly powerful, and I was just sort of explosively blissful. When you talk about these things, words are not enough. You cannot really explain it in words, but it was a kind of explosive, golden, blissful experience. And I wake up in the middle, because it was lucid, I was able to wake up in the middle of it and sat up in bed and had this Kundalini rush going, and was sitting there in meditation. I don't know for how long, and I don't remember what time of the night it was. I remember just my alarm clock. This was in the early days when we had the alarm clocks. And I was, just sort of woken up out of this trance. And then I'm sort of totally stunned by this whole thing. And the only desire I have is to continue meditation. So I walk outside. I was in a friend's house. I walk into his garden. I sit down under a cherry tree in the spring, and I sit down and meditate. And this blissful experience just continues, and everything is just bliss. I don't feel I have a body. I don't feel there's any distinction between me and everything around me. And I open my eyes and I realize that everything is sort of transparent. And I've never had, an experience like that. And for the next 3 days, I was in this clairvoyant state. I could hear or sort of feel what people were thinking. I could foresee things that was going to happen. Like my friend or his girlfriend broke up with him, and I knew that was going to happen in the afternoon, and it happened, things like that. But it was so intense that after a few days, I said, to hell with this. I don't want this anymore. This is too much. And this is when I started to understand the darker side of occult powers, that everything is dualistic within the dualistic realm. And it has positives and it has negatives. And so it started to become a burden, because I was not spiritually ready for all that, or couldn't consciously transcend it in a healthy way, because I was, too young and inexperienced. So that's one experience like that. But then there are others, as I've gotten older and more experienced, more internal, that are more integrated, and they become more internal consciousness, awareness, spiritual experiences that are about peace, love, bliss, in a more silent way. That awakening into consciousness beyond the chit chat of the chitta.
I should hope so. I mean, you mentioned earlier that he was meditating since you were, 13? You said you're meditating
19.
6 years. I thought by the time you were 19, you said you'd been meditating 6 years already. So I was thinking, wow.
No. 6 years after 19,
okay,
I went.
This guy started early. Well, nevertheless, you've been meditating a long, long time. And what are you doing? I mean, just to finally round up, what are you doing with your days these days? You mentioned you're in the US. You're in Asheville, North Carolina, I think.
Yeah,
right?
Asheville, North Carolina. And I work at the Prama Institute, which I co-founded 17 years ago. And I am at the Prama Wellness Center. I'm director at the Prama Wellness Center, where we focus on juice fasting, cleansing, yoga, meditation. We do retreats, and which is kind of untraditional. I guess I blend aspects of Ayurveda and naturopathy in helping people with their health and to cleanse and so on, and combining, a holistic lifestyle. I think of it as teaching lifestyle techniques from the yogic tradition.
And are you working on anything in terms of new books at all?
Well, I'm working on re-editing a book that was titled Tantra, the Yoga of Love and Awakening, which was published by Hay House, India, some years ago. So I'm rewriting that. So that should be coming out soon. And then I'm working on another book on health, the different experiences with health and yoga.
Sounds like it keeps you busy enough. Look, listen, I wasn't going to ask you, but I'll ask you anyway, because you're a guest and I haven't met you before. So I'll do the normal roundup that I haven't done for a while, which is just asking you if you have a guilty pleasure. You don't have to be guilty about it, but a particular normal pleasure that you take pleasure in your life. And then something which inspires you without mentioning your guru, who I know would be the inspiration, but something else that inspires you in life to carry on going, carry on working and helping.
Yeah. I think poetry and in particular, the poetry of Kabir, Mirabai, that is something I use. And also because, in my teachings and in my classics, I often draw on that. For example, just a stanza from Kabir where he says, Ishvara, he doesn't use the term Ishvara, but sort of God. Where is God? The breath inside the breath. And things like that to me is so inspiring. And then, and kirtan, doing kirtan and chanting, being in nature. I have a dog and, we live in the forest. And so these are things that really inspires me and make me feel that, even though the world is seemingly falling apart at the seams in many ways, there are beautiful things in this world. And, and good food, good Indian food.
It gives you pleasure. Apologies.
Yeah. To a degree, because too much of it is not good. But yeah.
Yeah, it depends who's cooking. Maybe depends what type.
Yeah, my wife is Indian and she's a good cook. And there's at least one good Indian restaurant here in Nashville. So
okay, right.
Yeah.
Next time I'm in the US, I'll come round.
Yeah, it would be nice. Yeah.
Thanks, Fred. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks very much for coming on and chatting with me. I recommend the book that I'll put in the show notes as well to everyone as a really good introduction to a subject which is contentious, but very interesting about these different streams in the yoga tradition and the idea that there's not just one stream or hasn't chronologically morphed from one stream to another stream, that there are maybe two divergent, as you said, two crisscrossing rivers in this whole subject. So that's very interesting and well worth a read to anyone that's listening. So please do. And thank you, Ramesh, again for your time. It's been a pleasure and honor to meet you in person after reading that book. So thanks for making that happen for us.
Oh, thank you so much, Adam. It's been a pleasure being here with you today. Siddhi Vinayak Namo Namah Ashta